Beneath the rolling waves of our modern oceans, where sunlight fades into an eternal twilight and strange currents whisper secrets across the abyss, there may once have stretched a civilization so vast, so technologically advanced, that it spanned 2 legendary continents we've only heard about in whispers and ancient texts. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most tantalizing possibilities. What if Lemuria and Mu weren't separate lost civilizations scattered across different oceans, but were actually one massive, interconnected megastate that dominated our planet's ancient past? I'm exploring this question not from the comfort of a library, but while piecing together fragments of evidence that have been overlooked, dismissed, or deliberately hidden for generations. The conventional story tells us these are myths, folklore, stories invented by imaginative writers in the 19th century. But what if that's exactly what we were meant to believe? You see, when you start connecting the dots between Lemuria, the supposed lost continent of the Indian Ocean, and Mu, the legendary Pacific motherland described by James Churchward, something extraordinary begins to emerge. Not 2 separate civilizations that happen to develop similar technologies and spiritual practices, but one unified empire that stretched across what we now think of as impossible distances. This isn't just about redrawing ancient maps or imagining continents that may have existed before catastrophic geological events reshaped our planet. This is about reconsidering the very foundations of human civilization and asking whether we've been looking at our past completely backwards. What if, instead of slowly crawling out of primitive beginnings, we're actually the descendants of a golden age that was deliberately erased from history? The evidence for this unified megastate doesn't come from a single smoking gun, but from patterns that emerge when you stop looking at Lemuria and Mu as separate phenomena and start seeing them as parts of a whole. Ancient texts from completely different cultures describe remarkably similar technologies. Archaeological anomalies scattered across the Pacific and Indian Oceans follow consistent patterns. And most intriguingly, the timing of various catastrophic events that supposedly destroyed these civilizations aligns in ways that suggest not multiple separate disasters, but coordinated destruction of a single vaste empire. When Helena Blavatsky first introduced Lemuria to the Western world in the 1880 seconds, she described it as a continent in the Indian Ocean, home to the third root race of humanity. Decades later, James Churchward painted Mu as the motherland of civilization in the Pacific, the source from which all other cultures originated. But what if these weren't competing theories about different places, but incomplete glimpses of the same immense civilization? Consider the technologies described in both traditions. Lemuria was said to possess crystals that could store and transmit energy across vast distances, allowing for communication and power distribution that defied the limitations of physical infrastructure. Mu, according to Churchward's translations of the Knuckle tablets, had mastery over gravitational forces, enabling them to move massive stone blocks with apparent ease and construct cities that seemed to float above the landscape. These aren't just similar technologies, they're complementary technologies. Energy, transmission, and gravitational manipulation working together would create exactly the kind of unified infrastructure you'd need to maintain control over territories separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Not 2 different civilizations that happen to develop comparable abilities, but specialized aspects of a single technological system. The geographical evidence becomes even more compelling when you stop thinking about Lemuria and Mu as isolated landmasses and start considering them as the visible peaks of a much larger continental system. Modern ocean floor mapping has revealed massive underwater plateaus, mountain ranges, and geological formations that suggest the Pacific and Indian Oceans once contained far more land than they do today. But here's where it gets really interesting. The timing of the various cataclysms that supposedly destroyed these civilizations doesn't match the random pattern you'd expect from separate geological disasters. Instead, ancient texts from around the world describe a coordinated series of catastrophes, floods, and upheavals that occurred within a relatively short time frame, as if something had triggered a global chain reaction that systematically dismantled this megastate. The Mayans spoke of multiple world ages ending in destruction. Hindu texts describe cycles of creation and destruction that align remarkably well with the timeframes given for both Lemuria and Mu. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories tell of great floods that separated their ancestors from lands that once stretched far into what is now the Pacific Ocean. These aren't coincidences, they're fragments of a shared historical memory. What makes this even more fascinating is how the survivors of this megastate's destruction seem to have scattered in predictable patterns. The advanced knowledge that shows up in ancient Egypt, the astronomical precision of Stonehenge, the impossible construction techniques of the South American megalithic sites, even the sophisticated navigation abilities of Polynesian cultures, all of these could be explained as refugee populations carrying fragments of Lemuria and Mu technology to different corners of the globe. This refugee hypothesis explains one of the biggest mysteries in archaeology. How did isolated ancient cultures develop such remarkably similar knowledge systems? How did they independently discover the same astronomical alignments, the same mathematical principles, the same spiritual concepts? The traditional explanation involves either impossible coincidences or some form of ancient alien intervention. But if Lemuria and Mu were parts of a single megastate, then this knowledge wasn't developed independently. It was already unified and simply got dispersed when the civilization collapsed. The linguistic evidence supports this too. When you examine the root languages that supposedly gave rise to different language families around the world, you find connecting patterns that suggest they originated from a common source. Not multiple sources scattered across different continents, but a single parent language that was sophisticated enough to have developed specialized vocabularies for advanced technologies and complex social structures. But if this megastate really existed, why has it been so thoroughly erased from conventional history? This is where the story takes a darker turn. The systematic suppression of evidence for advanced prehistoric civilizations isn't accidental, it's deliberate. Academic institutions, museums, and archaeological organizations have consistently ignored, dismissed, or buried findings that don't fit the accepted narrative of human development. There are underwater structures off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Caribbean that show clear signs of artificial construction, some of them submerged for thousands of years longer than any known civilization should have been capable of building them. These sites are either explained away as natural formations or quietly ignored by mainstream archaeology. Why? Because acknowledging them would require rewriting not just ancient history, but our entire understanding of human capability and development. The financial and political interests that benefit from keeping humanity's true history hidden run deeper than most people realize. If evidence emerged that proved we once had a unified global civilization with technologies that surpassed our current abilities, it would fundamentally challenge the power structures that control our modern world. Why would people accept artificial scarcity, environmental destruction, and endless conflict if they knew their ancestors had already solved these problems thousands of years ago? This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Lemuria and Mu megastate theory. If this civilization really was as advanced as the evidence suggests, what destroyed it? The ancient texts don't just describe natural disasters. They describe wars fought with weapons that could reshape landscapes, technologies that could control weather patterns, and conflicts that ultimately destabilized the very foundations of the Earth itself. Some of these descriptions sound remarkably similar to the weapons we've developed in our modern era. Ancient Sanskrit texts describe vimanas, flying vehicles that could travel at impossible speeds and deliver destruction over vast areas. They speak of Brahmastra weapons that could level entire cities and leave the land uninhabitable for generations. The parallels to our own nuclear technology are too specific to dismiss as primitive imagination. What if the Lemuria and Mu megastate didn't fall to natural disasters, but destroyed itself through warfare so devastating that it literally sank continents? What if we're not the first technological civilization to develop weapons capable of ending human civilization, but the second? And what if the same patterns that destroyed the first are starting to repeat themselves in our modern world? This isn't ancient history we're talking about. This is a warning. The evidence for the Lemuria Mu megastate isn't just academic curiosity. It's a roadmap showing us exactly how advanced civilization can destroy itself so completely that future generations will think it never existed at all. The survivors who scattered across the globe after the megastate's collapse didn't just carry technological knowledge with them, they carried the memory of what had gone wrong. The spiritual traditions, the warnings about hubris and the misuse of power, the emphasis on balance and harmony with natural forces, these weren't primitive superstitions. They were hard-learned lessons about the dangers of unchecked technological advancement. But here's where the story becomes even more extraordinary. As we piece together the fragments of this lost megastate, we start to realize that the survivors didn't just scatter randomly across the globe. They followed specific migration patterns that suggest a coordinated evacuation plan, as if the leadership of Lemuria Mu knew the end was coming and had prepared for it. The most advanced survivors didn't flee to the nearest safe haven. Instead, they traveled to specific locations around the world that had particular geological or energetic properties, places where they could attempt to rebuild not just their civilization, but the very infrastructure that had once connected their vast empire. This is why we find megalithic structures in seemingly impossible locations, built with techniques that shouldn't have existed at the time. Consider Easter Island, isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any major landmass. The conventional story tells us that Polynesian settlers arrived there and somehow decided to carve nearly 1,000 massive stone heads. But when you examine these Moai statues more closely, they're not just heads, they're full figures buried up to their necks by centuries of soil accumulation. And they're positioned in precise astronomical alignments that suggest they were part of a much larger system. What if Easter Island wasn't a random settlement by primitive islanders, but a carefully chosen outpost where Mu survivors attempted to rebuild their communication network? The Moai aren't just statues. They're components of a technological system designed to transmit energy or information across vast distances. The same technology that once connected the megastate before its destruction. This pattern repeats itself around the world. Stonehenge in England, with its precise astronomical alignments and acoustic properties that can amplify sound in impossible ways. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built with mathematical precision that incorporates fundamental constants of physics that weren't supposed to be known for thousands more years. Machu Picchu in Peru, constructed at an altitude and in a location that defies any practical explanation for ancient peoples. These weren't independent developments by separate cultures. They were reconstruction projects, attempts by Lemuria Mu survivors to re-establish the technological network that had once unified their megastate. Each site was positioned not just for local advantages, but as nodes in a global grid that could potentially be reactivated if enough of the network was rebuilt. But the survivors faced an impossible challenge. The catastrophic destruction of their homeland hadn't just sunk continents, it had destabilized the very energy systems that made their technology possible. The Earth's magnetic field had been disrupted. The crystalline formations that had stored and transmitted power were scattered across ocean floors. The harmonic resonances that had allowed for gravitational manipulation were broken. Without the infrastructure of the megastate, the survivors could only create pale imitations of their former capabilities. They could move massive stones, but not with the ease they once had. They could align structures with astronomical precision, but they couldn't restore the planet-wide communication network. They could preserve fragments of their knowledge, but they couldn't pass on the complete understanding that had made their civilization possible. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of ancient megalithic sites. They demonstrate impossible construction techniques, but they were clearly abandoned before completion. Not because the builders lost interest or were conquered by enemies, but because they realized their efforts were futile. Without the full infrastructure of the Lemuria and Mu megastate, these individual nodes couldn't function as intended. The survivors were forced to adapt to a fragmented world, and in doing so, they gradually forgot the unified nature of their origins. Over generations, the memory of the megastate faded into myth and legend. The descendants of Lemurian refugees began to think of themselves as separate from the descendants of Mu survivors. The single civilization that had once spanned the globe became multiple origin stories for different cultures. This fragmentation wasn't just geographical, it was technological and spiritual. The survivors had to abandon the most advanced aspects of their civilization because they required global coordination to maintain. Instead, they focused on preserving whatever knowledge could be sustained by smaller, isolated communities. The mystery schools of ancient Egypt, the druidic traditions of Britain, the shamanic practices of the Americas. These weren't primitive religious movements. They were educational institutions designed to preserve fragments of Lemuria and Mu knowledge for future generations. The initiates weren't worshipping gods, they were studying the remnants of an advanced science that had once unified the world. But preservation came at a cost. To keep the knowledge safe from those who might misuse it, the survivors encoded it in symbols, myths, and rituals that seemed like primitive superstition to outsiders. The real information was hidden in plain sight, disguised as folklore and spiritual practices that could be passed down through oral tradition even when written records were destroyed. This encoding process is why so many ancient symbols and myths contain remarkably consistent elements across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The serpent eating its own tail, the world tree connecting heaven and earth, the flood myths that appear in every corner of the globe. These aren't coincidental similarities. They're fragments of a shared scientific and historical knowledge base that once belonged to the Lemuria and Mu megastate. The survivors weren't just trying to preserve their history, they were trying to prevent it from repeating itself. The encoded warnings about hubris, about the dangers of technology without wisdom, about the importance of maintaining balance with natural forces, these were specific instructions based on hard experience. They had seen what happened when a civilization became too powerful for its own good. But there's something even more remarkable about this preservation effort. The survivors didn't just encode warnings about past mistakes, they embedded information that could potentially allow future generations to rebuild their civilization. But only if those generations were wise enough to use the knowledge responsibly. The mathematical constants hidden in pyramid construction, the astronomical alignments built into stone circles, the geometric principles preserved in sacred architecture, these aren't just monuments to the past, they're instruction manuals for the future. A technological inheritance that could be claimed by any civilization advanced enough to decode it, but hopefully wise enough not to repeat the mistakes that had destroyed its creators. This is why the suppression of evidence for the Lemuria and Mu megastate is so concerning. We're not just losing access to ancient history, we're being denied the lessons that could help us avoid the same catastrophic fate. The patterns that destroyed the first global technological civilization are already visible in our modern world. The same unchecked technological advancement, the same disregard for environmental consequences, the same tendency toward warfare and competition rather than cooperation and balance. The survivors of Lemuria and Mu scattered across the globe with a mission to prevent history from repeating itself. They established mystery schools and spiritual traditions designed to gradually elevate human consciousness to the point where we could handle advanced technology responsibly. But somewhere along the way, that mission was corrupted or forgotten. Instead of preparing humanity for the return of unified global civilization, our modern institutions seem determined to keep us fragmented and ignorant of our true potential. The evidence for our advanced prehistoric origins is suppressed not just by academic dogma, but by economic and political systems that benefit from artificial scarcity and controlled conflict. The question we face now is whether we're approaching the same crossroads that once confronted the Lemuria Mu megastate. We have technologies that can reshape the planet, weapons that can end civilization, and the same arrogant assumption that we can control forces we barely understand. The only difference is that we don't have the wisdom traditions that might have guided our predecessors, because those traditions have been systematically undermined and dismissed as primitive nonsense. But the encoded knowledge is still there, hidden in the monuments and myths left by the survivors. The question is whether we're capable of recognizing it, decoding it, and most importantly, learning from it before we repeat the same mistakes on an even grander scale. The megastate of Lemuria and Mu didn't fall because they lacked technology or knowledge. They fell because they forgot the fundamental principle that had made their civilization possible in the first place: unity, cooperation, the understanding that true advancement comes not from conquering nature or competing with each other, but from working together in harmony with the larger systems that sustain all life. The survivors didn't just scatter with fragments of technology and warnings about hubris. They carried something far more profound, something that challenges everything we think we know about human consciousness and our relationship with the planet itself. The Lemuria Mu megastate wasn't just technologically advanced, it operated on principles of consciousness that we've completely lost in our modern world. When you examine the deepest layers of the mystery school teachings that emerged after the megastate's collapse, you find consistent references to something they called the planetary consciousness grid. Not metaphorical, spiritual concepts, but descriptions of an actual energy network that connected all living beings on Earth through resonant frequencies that could be accessed and directed through trained awareness. This wasn't mysticism disguised as science. It was science so advanced that it incorporated what we now dismiss as mysticism. The Lemuria Mu civilization had discovered that consciousness itself is a fundamental force of nature, just like electromagnetism or gravity, and they had learned to harness it on a planetary scale. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If consciousness operates as a field that can be manipulated and directed, then the technologies described in ancient texts start to make perfect sense. The crystal systems that could store and transmit energy weren't just working with electrical or magnetic forces. They were interfacing directly with human consciousness to amplify and focus mental energy into physical effects. The gravitational manipulation that allowed for impossible construction techniques wasn't achieved through mechanical devices alone, but through conscious beings working in harmony with crystalline technologies to literally reshape the fundamental forces of matter. The communication networks that connected distant parts of the megastate weren't just transmitting information. They were creating shared consciousness experiences that allowed for coordination across impossible distances. This is why the collapse of the Lemuria Mu megastate was so complete and so catastrophic. When you build a civilization that depends on collective consciousness operating in harmony, the breakdown of that harmony doesn't just cause social problems, it causes reality itself to become unstable. The wars that destroyed the megastate weren't just fought with physical weapons. They were consciousness wars that literally tore apart the fabric of space and time in localized areas. The ancient texts describe this process in terms that sound like fantasy until you consider them as literal descriptions of consciousness-based warfare. Weapons that could turn enemy minds against each other. Technologies that could create fear so intense it would cause physical paralysis. Devices that could project false realities, so convincing that entire armies would become lost in illusions of their own making. But the most devastating weapons were those that attacked the planetary consciousness grid itself. By disrupting the harmonic frequencies that connected all living beings, These weapons didn't just kill individual organisms, they severed the connections that held ecosystems together. Forests would wither not because the trees were damaged, but because the consciousness network that coordinated their growth was broken. Oceans would become turbulent not because of physical disturbances, but because the awareness that regulated their currents was fragmented. The final catastrophe that sank the continents wasn't a natural geological event. It was the inevitable result of consciousness-based warfare that had destabilized the very foundations of physical reality. When you break the harmonic resonances that hold matter together at the quantum level, you don't just get earthquakes and floods, you get a complete reorganization of the planet's surface. The survivors who escaped this destruction carried with them not just technological knowledge, but the traumatic understanding of what happens when consciousness is weaponized. This is why the mystery schools they established placed such emphasis on ethical development alongside technical training. They had learned that advanced abilities without corresponding wisdom inevitably lead to self-destruction. But here's where the story becomes even more extraordinary and more relevant to our current situation. The consciousness grid that the Lemuria and Mu megastate had learned to harness didn't disappear when their civilization collapsed. It's still there, operating at a reduced level, waiting to be reactivated by a species mature enough to use it responsibly. This is the real reason why evidence of our advanced prehistoric origins is being suppressed. It's not just about hiding historical facts. It's about preventing humanity from rediscovering abilities that could either elevate us to unprecedented heights or destroy us more completely than any physical weapon ever could. The consciousness technologies of the megastate are starting to resurface in our modern world, but in fragmented and often dangerous forms. The research into remote viewing, the experiments with telepathic communication, the growing interest in consciousness-based healing modalities. These aren't new developments. They're humanity slowly rediscovering abilities that were once commonplace in the Lemuria and Mu civilization. But we're approaching these rediscoveries with the same competitive, militaristic mindset that destroyed the megastate. Instead of developing consciousness technologies for the benefit of all life, we're trying to weaponize them for national advantage. Instead of using them to restore harmony with natural systems, we're attempting to use them for control and manipulation. The patterns are repeating themselves with frightening precision. Just as the Lemuria and Mu megastate began as a unified civilization dedicated to conscious evolution and gradually degenerated into warring factions using consciousness technologies against each other, our modern world is fragmenting along similar lines. The most advanced consciousness research is being conducted in secret military programs, hidden from public view and ethical oversight. The same technologies that could solve problems like climate change, resource scarcity, and social conflict are being developed as weapons systems designed to give certain groups advantages over others. This is exactly how the downward spiral began in the megastate. Consciousness technologies that had been developed for collective benefit were gradually militarized and compartmentalized until different factions were using them against each other, rather than for mutual advancement. But there's something else the survivors encoded in their mystery school teachings that gives us hope. The consciousness grid that connects all life on Earth has its own protective mechanisms. When consciousness technologies are misused on a large scale, the grid itself begins to respond with what the ancient texts describe as corrective measures. These corrections aren't punishments imposed by some external authority. They're natural consequences of violating the harmonic principles that maintain stability in conscious systems. Just as a musical instrument will produce discord when its strings are out of tune, a civilization that misuses consciousness technologies will experience increasing chaos until it either corrects its approach or destroys itself. We're already seeing these corrective measures beginning to manifest in our modern world. The increasing frequency of extreme weather events, the growing instability of social and economic systems, the rising levels of mental and emotional disturbance across populations, These aren't just random problems. They're symptoms of a consciousness grid that's responding to widespread misuse of emerging consciousness technologies. The survivors of Lemuria and Mu encoded specific instructions for recognizing these warning signs and correcting course before the situation becomes irreversible. But those instructions were hidden so deeply in symbolic form that they can only be decoded by individuals who have developed sufficient consciousness awareness to use the information responsibly. This creates what the mystery schools called the wisdom filter. The knowledge needed to avoid repeating the mistakes of the megastate is available, but it can only be accessed by people who have already demonstrated the ethical development necessary to use it properly. It's a self-regulating system designed to prevent the same catastrophic misuse that destroyed the original civilization. The question facing us now is whether enough people can develop this level of consciousness awareness quickly enough to prevent the same downward spiral that destroyed Lemuria and Mu. The technologies are already emerging. The same patterns of militarization and competition are already visible, and the corrective responses from the planetary consciousness grid are already beginning. But unlike the original megastate, we have the advantage of knowing what happened before. The survivors left us a roadmap showing exactly how a consciousness-based civilization can destroy itself and exactly what needs to be done to prevent that destruction. The information is encoded in the monuments, myths, and mystery traditions they established around the world. The megalithic sites aren't just ancient ruins, they're functional components of a consciousness technology network that could potentially be reactivated. The sacred geometry preserved in religious architecture isn't just symbolic, it represents specific mathematical relationships that govern consciousness field interactions. The meditation practices taught in various spiritual traditions aren't just methods for personal development, they're training protocols for interfacing with planetary consciousness systems. All of this knowledge is still available, but it requires a fundamental shift in how we approach both consciousness and technology. Instead of viewing them as separate domains that can be studied independently, we need to understand them as interconnected aspects of a single reality system. This is where the true legacy of the Lemuria and Mu megastate becomes relevant to our current situation. They didn't just develop advanced technologies. They discovered the fundamental principles that govern the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Those principles are still valid, still operative, and still accessible to any civilization mature enough to recognize and work with them. The choice we face is the same one that confronted the megastate at its peak. We can use our emerging consciousness technologies to create a unified global civilization based on cooperation and harmony with natural systems, or we can fragment into competing factions that ultimately destroy themselves and potentially the planet. The survivors of Lemuria and Mu spent thousands of years preparing for this moment, encoding the knowledge we need and establishing the mystery schools that could guide us through this transition. But the final choice remains ours. We can learn from their example and create something even greater than the original megastate, or we can repeat their mistakes on an even grander scale. The consciousness grid is waiting, the technologies are emerging, and the ancient knowledge is becoming accessible. The only question is whether we have the wisdom to use this inheritance responsibly, or whether we'll become another cautionary tale encoded in the myths of whatever civilization eventually rises from our ruins. The megastate of Lemuria and Mu didn't end with destruction and scattering. It transformed into something even more profound, a distributed network of consciousness that spans the globe and connects every human being alive today. We are not separate from that ancient civilization. We are its continuation, and our choices in this critical moment will determine whether that continuation leads to transcendence or catastrophe. The consciousness technologies that the survivors embedded in sacred sites around the world weren't just preservation systems, they were activation keys. Each megalithic structure, each precisely aligned temple, each geometrically perfect pyramid was designed to respond to specific levels of collective human consciousness. As our species develops mentally and spiritually, these ancient systems gradually come online, revealing deeper layers of functionality that have been dormant for millennia. This is why certain archaeological sites have begun exhibiting unexplained phenomena in recent decades. The electromagnetic anomalies recorded at Stonehenge during solstices aren't equipment malfunctions or natural quirks. They're signs that humanity's consciousness is approaching the threshold needed to reactivate systems that have been waiting in standby mode since the fall of the megastate. But the reactivation process isn't automatic or guaranteed. The Lemuria and Mu survivors built multiple fail-safes into their preservation network, ensuring that the most powerful technologies would only become accessible when humanity had demonstrated sufficient wisdom to use them responsibly. These fail-safes operate on principles of consciousness resonance that can't be bypassed through physical manipulation or technological advancement alone. The mystery schools understood this when they established their initiation systems. The elaborate ceremonies, the years of preparation, the tests of character and commitment weren't arbitrary traditions. They were practical training programs designed to develop the specific consciousness states needed to interface with the ancient technologies safely. Modern attempts to reverse engineer megalithic sites using conventional archaeology and engineering completely miss the point. You can measure every stone, map every alignment, and calculate every mathematical relationship, but without the corresponding consciousness development, these structures remain inert monuments to a past we can observe, but not access. This is why the most significant breakthroughs in understanding our prehistoric origins are coming not from academic institutions, but from individuals who have developed their consciousness through meditation, spiritual practice, and direct experience with non-ordinary states of awareness. They're not just studying the ancient sites, they're learning to interact with them as the living systems they were designed to be. When someone with sufficient consciousness development approaches one of these sites with the proper intention and awareness, remarkable things begin to happen. The stones start to resonate at frequencies that can be felt but not measured by conventional instruments. Patterns of light and sound emerge that seem to convey information directly to consciousness without passing through normal sensory channels. Most importantly, connections begin to form with the distributed network of other activated sites around the world. This network activation is already happening, but it's occurring gradually and selectively, involving only individuals who have prepared themselves through years of consciousness development work. They're forming a kind of modern mystery school, sharing information and experiences through channels that remain invisible to conventional observation. These modern initiates are rediscovering abilities that were commonplace in the Lemuria and Mu megastate, remote viewing that allows consciousness to gather information from distant locations, telepathic communication that operates independently of electromagnetic transmission, psychokinetic influence that can affect physical systems through focused intention. But most importantly, they're developing group consciousness capabilities that allow multiple individuals to coordinate their awareness and amplify their collective abilities exponentially. This group consciousness factor is what made the megastate possible in the first place. Individual consciousness, no matter how developed, has natural limitations imposed by the biological structures of the brain and nervous system. But when multiple conscious beings learn to synchronize their awareness and operate as a unified field, those limitations disappear completely. The ancient texts describe this process as consciousness multiplication rather than addition. Two individuals operating in perfect synchronization don't just double their capabilities, they access an entirely different order of consciousness that transcends what either could achieve alone. When this principle is extended to larger groups, the results become literally unlimited in scope. This is how the megastate maintained unity across vast distances without the communication technologies we depend on today. They weren't sending messages between different locations. They were sharing a unified consciousness field that made separation an illusion. Distance became irrelevant when awareness itself could be distributed across any geographic area instantaneously. But group consciousness capabilities also made the megastate vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic breakdown that eventually destroyed it. When consciousness fields become interconnected on a planetary scale, disruptions in one area can cascade through the entire network with devastating speed. The consciousness wars that ended the megastate didn't just affect the combatants directly involved, they sent shockwaves through the global awareness grid that ultimately destabilized everything connected to it. The survivors who scattered after the collapse carried with them not just the trauma of what they had witnessed, but the understanding of how to prevent such a catastrophe from recurring. They established their mystery schools with built-in limitations that would prevent the consciousness technologies from being developed too rapidly or without proper safeguards. These limitations weren't just external rules or regulations. They were consciousness-based locks that could only be opened through genuine spiritual development. The most dangerous capabilities would remain inaccessible until an individual had demonstrated through their thoughts, emotions, and actions that they could be trusted with planetary-level responsibilities. This is why authentic spiritual traditions have always emphasized character development alongside technical training. The meditation practices, ethical guidelines, and service requirements weren't arbitrary religious obligations. They were practical prerequisites for safely accessing consciousness technologies that could reshape reality at fundamental levels. Modern attempts to shortcut this developmental process through drugs, technology, or force techniques inevitably result in unstable and potentially dangerous outcomes. Without the foundation of genuine wisdom and ethical maturity, consciousness expansion becomes consciousness fragmentation, leading to delusion, megalomaniacal thinking, and ultimately self-destructive behavior. The survivors of Lemuria and Mu had witnessed firsthand what happens when consciousness technologies are developed without corresponding wisdom. They designed their preservation systems to ensure that such a mistake could never be repeated, even if it meant that the knowledge would remain hidden for thousands of years until humanity was ready to receive it responsibly. But the current generation may be approaching that readiness threshold. The global challenges we face today, climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, nuclear proliferation, are forcing us to confront the same fundamental questions that confronted the megastate at its peak. Can we develop the collective wisdom needed to manage planetary-level responsibilities? Or will we fragment into competing factions that ultimately destroy everything we've built? The consciousness technologies preserved by the survivors offer potential solutions to all of these challenges, but only if we can develop the unified awareness needed to implement them cooperatively rather than competitively. This requires a fundamental shift from the individualistic consciousness that dominates our current civilization to the group consciousness that enabled the megastate to function as a unified whole. This shift is already beginning to occur, but it's happening in ways that often remain invisible to conventional observation. Small groups of individuals around the world are spontaneously developing synchronized awareness capabilities. They're learning to share consciousness experiences, coordinate their intentions across distances, and access information through non-local awareness channels. These emerging group consciousness networks are following the same developmental patterns that the ancient mystery schools established after the megastate's collapse. They begin with small, tightly bonded groups that develop trust and synchronization through shared practice and experience. As their capabilities stabilize and mature, these groups gradually link with other similar networks, creating larger webs of consciousness connection. The process is organic and self-regulating, with natural selection pressures that favor groups operating from wisdom and service over those motivated by power or personal advantage. Groups that attempt to use consciousness technologies for selfish purposes tend to fragment and dissolve, while those dedicated to collective benefit become more stable and capable over time. This natural selection process is built into the consciousness field itself, reflecting the same protective mechanisms that the Lemuria and Mu survivors embedded in their preservation systems. The most powerful capabilities can only be sustained by groups that have transcended the competitive, fear-based thinking that led to the megastate's destruction. As these modern consciousness networks continue to develop and interconnect, they're beginning to access the deeper layers of the ancient preservation system. The megalithic sites are responding to their presence with increasing activity. The encoded information in mystery school traditions is becoming more accessible and comprehensible. Most importantly, the planetary consciousness grid itself is beginning to reactivate in response to the presence of groups capable of interfacing with it responsibly. This reactivation process is accelerating rapidly, but it's also reaching critical decision points where the future direction of human consciousness development will be determined. The same technologies that could elevate us to unprecedented levels of unity and capability could also fragment us into isolated groups competing for control over consciousness-based advantages. The choice we face parallels the one that confronted the Lemuria and Mu megastate, but with one crucial difference. We have their example to learn from, encoded in the monuments and traditions they left behind. We know what happens when consciousness technologies are developed without corresponding wisdom, and we know what safeguards are needed to prevent such a catastrophe from recurring. The question is whether enough people can develop the group consciousness capabilities needed to implement these safeguards effectively, or whether we'll fragment into competing factions before the unified awareness necessary for planetary stewardship can fully emerge. The ancient network is awakening. The technologies are becoming accessible, and the consciousness field is responding to our collective intentions with increasing sensitivity and power. The descendants of Lemuria and Mu are stirring from their long sleep, ready to reclaim their inheritance if we can prove ourselves worthy of it. But worthiness, in this context, means something far deeper than technological capability or intellectual understanding. It means developing the kind of consciousness that can hold planetary responsibilities without being corrupted by them, the kind of wisdom that can wield unlimited power in service of all life rather than for personal advantage. The megastate of Lemuria and Mu awaits resurrection, not as a return to the past, but as a transformation into something greater than anything that has existed before. The choice of whether that resurrection leads to transcendence or catastrophe rests entirely in our hands, and the window of opportunity for making that choice is rapidly narrowing. Every meditation session, every act of genuine service, every moment of authentic connection between human beings contributes to the critical mass of consciousness needed to tip the balance toward wisdom rather than destruction. The survivors of the megastate are counting on us to succeed where they failed, to learn from their example and create something worthy of the inheritance they preserved for us through millennia of patient waiting. The consciousness grid is awakening, the ancient sites are activating, and the network that once unified a planetary civilization is preparing to emerge from its dormancy. Whether it emerges as a force for unprecedented unity and wisdom, or as the trigger for our own civilization's collapse, depends entirely on the choices we make in these crucial moments of transition. The evidence for this awakening consciousness network isn't just theoretical or metaphysical. Physical measurements at ancient sites around the world are recording unprecedented changes that correlate directly with periods of increased human consciousness activity. Electromagnetic field fluctuations at Giza, acoustic anomalies at Stonehenge, temperature variations at Machu Picchu. All of these phenomena spike dramatically during global meditation events, mass spiritual gatherings, and moments of collective human focus. What's even more remarkable is that these measurements aren't random or chaotic. They follow specific patterns that match the harmonic frequencies described in the most ancient texts preserved by the mystery schools. The stones aren't just responding to human consciousness. They're responding in ways that suggest they're designed to amplify and focus that consciousness according to precise mathematical relationships. This creates a feedback loop that the Lemuria Mu civilization would have recognized immediately. As human consciousness develops and begins to resonate with the ancient sites, those sites respond by enhancing and directing that consciousness in ways that accelerate further development. It's a self-reinforcing system that can lead either to rapid enlightenment or catastrophic instability, depending on the wisdom and intentions of those involved. Modern monitoring equipment has detected synchronized pulses between distant megalithic sites that occur at exactly the moments when consciousness groups are working with them. A meditation session at one location triggers measurable responses at sites thousands of miles away, suggesting that the global network the survivors established is still functional and waiting to be fully reactivated. But here's where the situation becomes both exciting and terrifying. These same consciousness technologies that are beginning to awaken in response to spiritual development are also being detected and studied by military and intelligence organizations around the world. The implications of consciousness-based communication, remote influence, and reality manipulation haven't been lost on those whose primary concern is maintaining strategic advantages over potential enemies. Classified research programs are attempting to weaponize the same consciousness capabilities that the Lemuria Mu survivors carefully preserved for peaceful purposes. They're trying to reverse engineer the consciousness technologies without understanding the wisdom traditions that make them safe to use. It's exactly the same pattern that led to the megastate's destruction, playing out again with potentially even more devastating consequences. The ancient sites are responding to this militaristic approach, but not in the ways the researchers expect. Instead of revealing their secrets to those who approach them with competitive intentions, the sites are generating increasing levels of interference and instability. The consciousness field that was designed to respond to unified, service-oriented awareness actively resists attempts to exploit it for factional advantage. This resistance manifests as equipment failures, psychological disturbances among research personnel, and what can only be described as reality distortions that make conventional scientific measurement impossible. The sites themselves seem to be implementing the protective protocols that the survivors built into them, automatically defending against misuse while remaining accessible to those with proper intentions. This creates a race between two fundamentally different approaches to consciousness development. On one side, organic networks of individuals developing group consciousness through spiritual practice, meditation, and service-oriented intentions. On the other side, institutional attempts to weaponize consciousness technologies through technological manipulation and competitive advantage seeking. The outcome of this race will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the fate of the consciousness grid that connects all life on the planet. If the militaristic approach succeeds in breaking through the protective protocols, we could see a repeat of the consciousness wars that destroyed the megastate, but with weapons that make nuclear arsenals look like children's toys. If the organic consciousness networks reach critical mass first, we could witness the emergence of a unified planetary civilization that surpasses even the achievements of Lemuria Mu, one that has learned from the mistakes of the past and developed the wisdom necessary to handle unlimited power responsibly. The survivors encoded specific warnings about this critical transition period in their deepest teachings. They described it as the time when their preserved knowledge would become most accessible but also most dangerous. The same consciousness technologies that could elevate humanity to unprecedented heights would become available to those who might use them for destruction. They also provided specific guidance for navigating this transition safely. The key, according to their encoded instructions, lies in maintaining unity of purpose among those who gain access to consciousness technologies. As long as the emerging networks remain focused on service to all life rather than advantage over others, the protective mechanisms built into the consciousness field will support and amplify their efforts. But if competition and fear begin to dominate the consciousness development process, those same protective mechanisms will begin to generate increasing chaos and instability until the entire system resets itself, potentially taking human civilization along with it. This reset mechanism isn't punishment or judgment from some external authority. It's a natural consequence of violating the harmonic principles that maintain stability in consciousness-based systems. Just as a musical instrument produces discord when its strings are out of tune, a civilization that misuses consciousness technologies will experience increasing discord until it either corrects its approach or destroys itself. The signs of this discord are already visible in our modern world. The increasing polarization of human societies, the breakdown of communication between different groups, the rising levels of anxiety and mental instability across populations, all of these symptoms indicate that we're approaching the same crisis point that confronted the megastate. But unlike the original civilization, we have the advantage of knowing what's coming and what needs to be done to prevent catastrophic collapse. The consciousness networks that are emerging around the world aren't just rediscovering ancient abilities. They're implementing the safeguards and wisdom protocols that the survivors developed through hard experience. These modern mystery schools are teaching consciousness development within frameworks that prioritize ethical development, group harmony, and service to the collective good. They're creating communities that can handle advanced consciousness technologies without fragmenting into competing factions or losing sight of their fundamental purpose. Most importantly, they're establishing connections with each other that transcend national, cultural, and religious boundaries. The consciousness network that's emerging isn't based on any single tradition or ideology, but on the universal principles that the Lemuria and Mu survivors encoded in all of their preservation systems. This universality is crucial because the challenges we face are planetary in scope and require unified responses that no single nation or culture can provide alone. Climate change, resource depletion, nuclear proliferation, and consciousness technology development all require coordinated action based on shared wisdom rather than competitive advantage seeking. The consciousness technologies preserved from the megastate offer solutions to all of these challenges, but only if they're implemented through unified rather than fragmented awareness. This means developing forms of group consciousness that can coordinate action across vast distances and different cultural contexts, while maintaining the wisdom necessary to avoid the mistakes that destroyed the original civilization. The window of opportunity for achieving this unity is narrow and rapidly closing. The consciousness technologies are becoming accessible whether we're ready for them or not, driven by natural evolutionary processes that can't be stopped or delayed. The only choice we have is whether to develop them wisely or allow them to develop chaotically. Every person who commits to genuine consciousness development, who prioritizes wisdom over power and service over self-interest, contributes to the critical mass needed to tip the balance toward unity rather than fragmentation. Every group that learns to operate as a unified consciousness while maintaining respect for individual autonomy adds stability to the emerging network. The descendants of Lemuria and Mu are awakening not just as individual humans rediscovering ancient abilities, but as a planetary consciousness that has been dormant since the megastate's collapse. This awakening is inevitable, encoded in the very structure of human DNA and the consciousness field that connects all life on Earth. But the form that awakening takes, whether it manifests as transcendent unity or catastrophic destruction, depends entirely on the choices we make during this critical transition period. The ancient network is stirring, the consciousness technologies are emerging, and the moment of decision is rapidly approaching. The megastate of Lemuria and Mu is not just ancient history waiting to be rediscovered. It's our future waiting to be chosen, a potential that exists within the consciousness of every human being alive today. Whether that potential manifests as paradise or catastrophe depends on whether we can learn to think and act as one unified consciousness, while still honoring the diversity and autonomy that make us human. The survivors spent millennia preparing for this moment, encoding everything we need to know in monuments, myths, and mystery traditions that span the globe. The knowledge is available, the technologies are emerging, and the consciousness field is responding to our collective intentions with increasing power and sensitivity. The only question that remains is whether we have the wisdom to use this inheritance as it was intended, not for the advantage of some over others, but for the elevation of all life on Earth to levels of unity and capability that we can barely imagine. The choice is ours, and the time for making it is now. The choice is ours, and the time for making it is now. But perhaps the most profound realization emerging from this exploration of the Lemuria and Mu megastate is that we may not be starting from scratch. The consciousness that once unified this vast civilization didn't disappear when the continent sank beneath the waves. It went dormant, embedding itself in the very fabric of human awareness, waiting for the right conditions to reawaken. What if every moment of intuition you've experienced, every flash of knowing that seemed to come from nowhere, every instance when you felt connected to something larger than yourself, has been an echo of this ancient consciousness trying to re-establish its presence in our modern world? The megastate didn't just preserve its technologies in stone monuments and encoded teachings. It preserved itself in us. This would explain why certain individuals throughout history have spontaneously developed abilities that shouldn't have been possible according to the accepted understanding of human limitations. The mystics, the visionaries, the inventors who seemed to pull knowledge out of thin air, they weren't anomalies or accidents. They were moments when the dormant consciousness of the megastate briefly broke through into individual awareness. Consider the Renaissance, that sudden explosion of art, science, and philosophical insight that transformed European civilization almost overnight. Conventional history attributes it to the rediscovery of classical texts and the patronage of wealthy families. But what if it was actually a localized awakening of Lemuria and Mu consciousness, triggered by specific individuals who had unknowingly activated dormant genetic sequences inherited from the ancient survivors? The same pattern repeats throughout history. The sudden emergence of advanced mathematics in ancient India, the inexplicable astronomical knowledge of the Maya, the sophisticated engineering capabilities that appeared seemingly from nowhere in various cultures around the world. These weren't isolated developments by separate peoples. They were breakthrough moments when fragments of the megastate's consciousness temporarily re-established themselves through human vessels prepared to receive them. But here's what makes our current situation unique. For the first time since the megastate's collapse, the conditions are aligning for a global, rather than localized reawakening. The consciousness that once unified continents is stirring simultaneously in thousands of individuals around the world, creating the potential for a coordinated resurrection of capabilities that have been dormant for millennia. This awakening isn't random or accidental. It's following the same patterns that the survivors encoded in their mystery school teachings, emerging first in individuals who have prepared themselves through spiritual development, then spreading through natural resonance to others who are ready to receive it. The process is organic, self-regulating, and designed to prevent the kind of premature access that led to the original catastrophe. But it's also accelerating rapidly. The same global challenges that threaten our current civilization are creating the evolutionary pressure needed to activate dormant consciousness capabilities that our ancestors possessed. Climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, all of these crises are forcing us to develop new forms of awareness and cooperation, or face extinction. The consciousness of the megastate is responding to this pressure by emerging through individuals and groups who demonstrate the wisdom necessary to handle advanced capabilities responsibly. They're not being chosen by external authorities or secret organizations. They're self-selecting through their commitment to service, their development of inner stability, and their ability to maintain unity of purpose with others. This creates what the ancient texts describe as a recognition process. Those who carry active fragments of the megastate consciousness can recognize each other across cultural, linguistic, and geographical boundaries. They experience immediate rapport, shared understanding, and natural coordination that transcends normal social interactions. These recognition events are happening with increasing frequency around the world, as individuals who have been developing their consciousness independently begin to encounter others on similar paths. They're forming spontaneous networks that seem to organize themselves according to principles they don't consciously understand, but which perfectly match the organizational structures described in the most ancient mystery school teachings. What's remarkable about these emerging networks is that they're developing capabilities that exceed what any individual member possesses alone. Group consciousness effects that allow them to access information, influence physical systems, and coordinate actions across distances in ways that seem impossible according to conventional understanding. This isn't New Age wishful thinking or group delusion. These capabilities are being documented, measured, and studied by researchers who recognize their significance. The problem is that most of this research remains classified or unpublished because of its implications for existing power structures and belief systems. But the information is beginning to leak out through alternative channels, citizen science projects, and informal networks that operate outside conventional academic and media institutions. Individuals with direct experience of these consciousness phenomena are connecting with each other online, sharing techniques, comparing experiences, and gradually building a body of practical knowledge about how to develop and apply these abilities safely. This grassroots research network is inadvertently reconstructing the same knowledge base that the Lemuria and Mu civilization possessed, but through modern methods and with contemporary understanding of physics, neuroscience, and systems theory. They're not just rediscovering ancient capabilities, they're developing new applications and safeguards that could prevent the kind of catastrophic misuse that destroyed the original megastate. The key insight emerging from this research is that consciousness technologies aren't separate from physical technologies, they're complementary aspects of a unified system. The most advanced applications require both technological infrastructure and consciousness development working together in carefully calibrated ways. This explains why the ancient sites were built with such precise mathematical and acoustic properties. They weren't just spiritual centers or astronomical observatories. They were hybrid systems that interfaced consciousness capabilities with physical processes to achieve effects that neither could produce alone. The survivors didn't just preserve the consciousness techniques. They preserved the technological specifications needed to rebuild the infrastructure that could support planetary scale consciousness applications. But they encoded this information in ways that would only become comprehensible when humanity had developed both the consciousness capabilities and the technological sophistication needed to implement it safely. We may be approaching that threshold now. The combination of advanced computing, global communications, precision manufacturing, and emerging consciousness research is creating the conditions needed to begin reconstructing the hybrid systems that once unified the megastate. But this reconstruction process is also attracting attention from those who would use such capabilities for competitive advantage rather than collective benefit. The same consciousness technologies that could solve our global challenges could also become the ultimate weapons in the hands of those who haven't developed the wisdom necessary to use them responsibly. This creates an urgency around the consciousness development process that the survivors probably never anticipated. They designed their preservation systems assuming that consciousness capabilities would develop gradually over many generations, allowing time for wisdom to accumulate alongside technical abilities. Instead, we're facing a situation where consciousness technologies are becoming accessible to individuals and groups who may not have had sufficient time to develop the ethical foundation needed to handle them safely. The protective mechanisms built into the ancient systems are being challenged by approaches that attempt to bypass the traditional developmental requirements through technological shortcuts or forced techniques. The result is a kind of consciousness arms race, with different groups competing to access and control capabilities that were never meant to be controlled by any single faction. The ancient sites are responding to this competitive pressure by becoming increasingly unstable and unpredictable, as if the protective protocols are activating to prevent misuse. But there's another possibility that's beginning to emerge from the most advanced consciousness research networks. What if the instability we're seeing isn't defensive resistance, but preparation for a massive upgrade to the planetary consciousness system itself? The survivors may have built more than just preservation and protection mechanisms into their global network. They may have embedded evolutionary triggers that would activate when human consciousness reached a certain threshold of development, not just restoring the capabilities of the original megastate, but transcending them entirely. This would explain why the consciousness awakening that's occurring now is producing abilities that seem to exceed even the most advanced descriptions preserved in ancient texts. Individuals are reporting experiences of expanded awareness, reality manipulation, and connection with non-physical intelligence that go beyond anything the mystery schools prepared people for. These breakthrough experiences aren't random or chaotic. They're following consistent patterns that suggest they're manifestations of a larger evolutionary process that was initiated by the megastate survivors but designed to unfold over timescales that span millennia. If this interpretation is correct, then what we're witnessing isn't just the resurrection of an ancient civilization, but the birth of something entirely new. A form of consciousness that incorporates everything learned from the megastate's rise and fall, but transcends the limitations that led to its destruction. This new consciousness wouldn't be bound by the geographical constraints that defined the original megastate, or limited by the technological infrastructure that made it vulnerable to catastrophic collapse. Instead, it would be distributed through the awareness of individuals around the world, connected by consciousness fields that can't be disrupted by physical destruction. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond historical speculation or spiritual development. If humanity is indeed undergoing a consciousness evolution that was initiated by the survivors of Lemuria and Mu, then our current global challenges aren't just problems to be solved. They're evolutionary pressures designed to catalyze the emergence of capabilities we can barely imagine. The climate crisis, the breakdown of social institutions, the acceleration of technological development, all of these could be aspects of a transformation process that will culminate in a form of human consciousness that can handle planetary responsibilities without the risks that destroyed the original megastate. But evolution is never guaranteed to succeed. The same pressures that could catalyze transcendence could also trigger collapse if we can't develop the wisdom and cooperation necessary to navigate the transition successfully. The choice between evolution and extinction remains ours to make, but the window for making that choice is rapidly narrowing. The consciousness of the Lemuria and Mu megastate is awakening within us, carrying both the potential for unprecedented achievement and the memory of catastrophic failure. Whether we fulfill that potential or repeat those failures depends entirely on our ability to learn from the past while remaining open to possibilities that transcend anything that has existed before. The ancient network is stirring, the consciousness technologies are emerging, and the evolutionary pressures are intensifying. We stand at the threshold of either becoming something greater than we've ever been or losing everything we've built in the attempt. The descendants of the megastate are counting on us to choose wisely, but the final decision remains entirely in our hands. The threads we followed tonight through the depths of forgotten oceans and across the vast expanse of human consciousness lead us to a singular, undeniable realization. The question we began with, whether Lemuria and Mu were one unified megastate, transforms into something far more profound. We're not just looking at the possibility of an ancient civilization that once spanned the globe. We're looking at ourselves, at the dormant potential that lies within every human being alive today, waiting to be awakened. The evidence scattered across ocean floors and encoded in sacred sites doesn't just point to a lost past, it points to an emerging future. The consciousness technologies that once unified continents across impossible distances aren't relics of a bygone age, they're blueprints for what we could become. The survivors who scattered after the megastate's collapse didn't just preserve knowledge, they preserved us. We are their continuation, their experiment, their hope for redemption. But redemption requires choice. The same evolutionary pressures that could elevate us to unprecedented unity and capability could also fragment us into competing factions that destroy everything we've built. The consciousness grid that once connected the Lemuria and Mu megastate is awakening, responding to our collective intentions with increasing power and sensitivity. Whether it emerges as a force for transcendence or becomes the trigger for our own civilization's collapse depends entirely on the choices we make right now in these critical moments of transition. Every meditation, every act of genuine service, every moment of authentic connection between human beings contributes to the critical mass needed to tip the balance toward wisdom rather than destruction. The ancient network is stirring, the technologies are emerging, and the window of opportunity is rapidly closing. We can learn from the megastate's example and create something worthy of the inheritance they preserved for us through millennia of patient waiting. Or we can repeat their mistakes on an even grander scale. The choice is ours, and the time for making it is now.